Hi. Hi. All right. So I'm Rahul, and this is Gaurav, just in case you were confused. So, yeah, we are going to talk about Flyte, which was a service offered by Flipkart. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar or were familiar with it because it's largely shut down today. But anybody knows what Flyte is? Nobody knows what Flyte is. One person knows what Flyte is. Excellent. So we can talk about that for a bit. But before we get into our talk, we wanted to talk about, we wanted to just get a sense of, this is going to be a design talk primarily. So how many of you are designers or have done some sort of design at any design? 1, 2, 3, oh gosh, I can count on one hand. 4, okay. How many of you build apps? How many of you write code? Okay. So what do the rest of you do? So we've got about 90% of you guys who haven't said one thing or the other. Are you studying to do one of these two things? Okay, so how many of you are students here? Okay, also. Right. So what are you studying? Are you studying engineering? Are you studying management, design? What do you... Okay, how many engineering students here? All right. How many engineering students here who write code? Okay, yeah, don't be shy. It's fine. It's allowed to be one. Some of my best friends are engineers, so it's okay. All right. So, yeah, sure. So, yeah, we'll start our talk. We're going to talk about Flyte, which was a service, a digital download service. We're going to talk about the Flyte mobile apps because they had apps on Android and on iOS and on Windows 8 devices. Here, of course, we're going to talk specifically about the Android devices which we worked on because that's most relevant. And then we're going to share some of the thinking behind our general design processes. We do a lot of what's called iterative design. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about some tips and mistakes that we made. Share them with you, and hopefully then you don't have to make the same ones. Right? So Gaurav, do you want to talk about Flyte?
So as you mentioned, I was the engineering manager at Flipkart on the Flyte apps. So basically, everyone here knows Flipkart, and Flipkart is a retailer. We were trying to sell stuff online. Flyte was the first time Flipkart was selling digital goods, right? Not things that you get shipped, but things that are sold and you download. Right? And the reason that digital is really important is that over time, like if you look at the US today, a lot of people are buying ebooks. Right? If you look at music, a lot of people are buying music as an MP3s. They're not buying CDs. Right? And with devices, with tablets, with smartphones, right? People want digital content. And as a retailer, it's a lot easier to deliver like MP3s and ebooks than to physically deliver books, right? So even for a Flipkart or an Amazon, there is an inherent interest in moving towards digital goods. So Flipkart knew that if they don't do it now, a couple of years later, Amazon or other companies would come in, and they wanted to start off selling music. And this is a very challenging thing to do because I'll ask another show of hands. How many of you have downloaded music illegally? Like pirated? Don't be shy. Okay. How many of you have paid for music? Okay, so that's pretty cool.
How many of you are familiar with this logo?
Yeah.
How many of you are familiar with the previous logo?
So Rahul's point, right? This is the Flyte logo. And the next one is Pirate Bay, which is where you can torrent all sorts of music. So Flipkart's biggest competitor was not Amazon or iTunes. It was basically Pirate Bay, right? And we wanted to try to build a service that would be so easy, so compelling, that people would actually want to buy music off of the service. And the app is a very, very core part of that, right? Most people are consuming music on their mobile phones or tablets. So we had to make sure that the app is really good. I think I'll let Rahul start talking about the design. And I think what you'll see from the talk is that it was a very, very iterative process. Like we had some ideas We shipped an app. We found that some things didn't work well. We found that some things that we didn't expect would work well actually worked for us. And it was a lot of learnings through those 6 months of just releasing apps, discussing stuff. He'll show you a lot of the design iterations. And I mean, for me as an engineer, the thing I took away is that you, as an engineer, I basically don't think so much about subtle aspects of design, right? But what Rahul brought into the process was small things can actually make a big difference in how users will use your app. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll see some of those subtle aspects. I gave you a compliment, so you're supposed to give me a compliment at some point today.
Gaurav can drive very well. Okay, so I think there's actually a reason that I think most of the other talks are done by one person alone. But there's a reason that there's a deliberate reason that we chose to do this talk together. Because one thing that we firmly believe at Uncommon, and I think that companies like Flipkart also realize that, is that today digital goods are not composed of either just design or technology. They're inextricably linked, right? You have to have both in equal proportion, or both in some proportion or the other, if you want to have a successful product, right? You can't have a beautiful app which is incredibly laggy and consumes all your battery life, so, in 20 minutes your phone is dead. You can't have an incredibly useful and functional app which is really, really ugly, which does really well. Not one which consumers will want to necessarily use a lot. So you need both aspects of this. And I think that's something that we were lucky enough to be able to do, that we had the ability to sort of have design and tech working very closely together. Because sometimes a lot of the objectives of, say, engineers or the objectives of design, as a group, are opposed to each other. They're different from each other, right? Design will say we want to do beautiful animations all over the app. And then engineering will say, you want to get something out next to your animation. Right? So that's a constant conversation that one happens. And then you add two other components into the mix. You add in the need to make money. You add in business, right? Because eventually somebody has to pay the designer, right? And the salaries for the engineers and so on. And then you add the other component, which is where you want your product to go, right? And that's a kind of a mix of all three of these things. It's not necessarily just design and tech, but product also takes some understanding from what is happening in the market. It's Diwali now. Should we have a sale? It's coming up to our 1-year anniversary. Should we do something large in terms of promotion? If we need to do promotion, what tech does the app need to have to do that, right? So there are these 4 kind of pillars on which you can build most of today's digital products. And there's an inherent tension between all these 4 corners, which needs to be resolved in some fashion. So I think the fact that we were able to work together and the fact that we're doing this talk together is a very deliberate choice throughout. And hopefully that's something that you'll see. There's a lot of compromise on both sides. And you know what they say, a good compromise leaves nobody happy. So there were a lot of situations when nobody was happy at the end of the day, but something good happened for the app and for the users of the app as a whole.
Just one more thing. How many of you have an understanding of what design is? I mean, engineering, I'm guessing a lot of you do, right? But what is design's role in building, let's say, an app? And what is what we call the product role or the product manager? Like, how many of you understand what a product manager would do and what a designer would do?
How many of you have heard the term product manager before? Okay.
Okay. So, I think this works. So I'll just give you a quick sort of introduction on what was the role of engineering, what was the role of design, and what was the role of the product manager. Again, engineering, we were building the app, we understood how to write code, we understood the framework, we didn't understand the framework, we told people we understand the framework, but we ended up learning the framework and writing basically the app. a lot of our focus was on the code, on the technology pieces. How do you... so, for example, the designer would focus a lot on the user experience. Right? When someone opens the app, what do they see? If you're, it's an MP3 app, so the music library is a very key part of that. What things are really important to have in the library, sort of at the top? What things can be sort of hidden away? Basically, maybe you should define your role, but
yeah, you're doing a good job at it.
Okay.
A designer typically will talk about what the experience that somebody has when they are using the app, right? So one thing that I tried to, a lot of people think of designers as artists, as painters. They put new colors on the app and bang, that's it, right? That's their job. They come in the morning, they pick a bunch of colors, they put it all over the app in some fashion, and then they go home, right? So I like to define design slightly differently. And this was something which I was very pleased to realize that Flipkart also understood, even if they weren't able to articulate it for a while. But design, to me, is the feeling that somebody has after they finish using your product, whatever that happens to be, whatever product that happens to be. It's not necessarily the feeling that way that something looks or necessarily the way that it works, but it's the overall feeling that you're left with when you are finished with a product or a service. So, I don't know, have you guys been using Flipkart for a while now? Have you seen the website change and become, I think, better over some time? Do you remember that it used to be really, really crappy? Okay, so it's now slightly less crappy, right? It's not.
Yeah. Anyway, another good example would be Make My Trip versus Clear Trip. Have you used both sites? Right, so Make My Trip, I think, is not very good design. A lot of things are hard to do. Simple examples, you're putting in your address, you have to type all sorts of fields. Whereas Clear Trip, like if you put in your PIN code, it picks up certain fields. So as a user of the site, it's taking a lot of the work out, and it's actually making me feel good. It's like I was able to book my ticket really, really simply. Right? But when I use Make My Trip, at the end of it, I'll get my ticket, but I'm just like, I spent so much time and it was irritating. Right? So I think that's what he's talking about, the emotional aspect. Right? At the end of using a product, you should feel good about the product and about yourself. If you have a product that makes you feel stupid, right? I had to, like, and that happens, right? A lot of apps will have these messages that make you feel stupid. And so all of those emotional aspects are very important in the design process.
Going to just complete and say, even though Flipkart had a really crappy website, right? You order something, you got it the next morning or 2 days later, right? And then you were like, wow, that's cool, right? Because it was the first time, I remember the first time that I ordered a refrigerator on Flipkart. And I was like, this is way cool. I click a button, 1 day later, 2 men come and they give me a refrigerator. That's really, really amazing, right? So that is the overall experience of the service. Not necessarily do the buttons look nice or, was orange a good choice or should they have been green. That's one aspect of it for sure. But the overall feeling that you have after you finish using a product is design, in my opinion.
And a product manager is typically someone who's sort of not from engineering, right? Maybe closer to the design side of things. Again, depends on companies. Some companies will have, a separate designer, separate product manager, separate engineering manager. But a product manager is someone who is thinking a lot about the user in terms of also user experience, but are we getting a lot of users using our platform, right? Are the features that we're building in this app actually helping users? Are there features that would certainly increase the number of users on the platform? Or for a paid product, what will it take to get more people to pay for this product? For an MP3 app, if a simple example, right? You may have you've bought one song from a certain movie, right? If the product can basically then show you recommendations at the bottom, right, and say maybe you like these songs as well, that is going to increase the likelihood that someone will buy a second or third song. Right? So that's a very, very simple product contribution where they're thinking of ways that people can use the product better. So cool. Now we're going to go into the slides.
So yeah, this roughly is what the Flipkart Android app used to look like. Flipkart MP3 Android app used to look like when in about, I think, August 2012. Yeah. This was, I think, version 2.0. So it had gone through some iterations already. But it was very basic, right? It was very, I don't know how appealing it looks to any of you. It was definitely, it had a lot of issues in terms of how much content we could show people in terms of, could they discover new stuff, whatever was happening. How much area do we have to actually show new content or different types of content? So we had new and bestsellers, but could we do anything else? Now, it's not terribly clear because of the slide, because of the projector, but how many of you can see the tab bar at the bottom? Yeah, can you see the tab bar? What is, does anything strike you about it? Have you seen that? Have you seen a similar tab bar on iOS? Yes? No? Maybe? Yeah? Okay, so this is a very typical design convention from the Apple platform, from iOS, right? Which did set the design language for all smartphones for a while. But Android has its own set of guidelines. How many of you use an Android phone here? A lot of people, right? How many of you use an iOS device? Okay. So that's a good, yeah. So maybe that's why you haven't seen this tab bar on iOS devices before. But you typically wouldn't see this on a well-designed Android application because they've moved all of their stuff to a very different way of thinking. They've moved things to what's called the action bar, which is usually on top of the screen, right? So there's a whole lot of conventions here which have been borrowed from different platforms but are not necessarily native to Android. And I think that if you have a well-designed app, it has to fit within the overall family of apps that that platform has. Otherwise, users get confused quite easily. You want your apps to behave more or less in the same way, right? So this is something called a design affordance. Do you guys know what a design affordance is? Okay. When you have to put on a light, do you have to think about how the switch works? Which way do you push a switch so that the lights turn on? I can't hear you guys. Down? Put it off. It goes up, right? Okay, so do you know, now have you thought about, have you seen when fuses trip in your house, right? They do the opposite. When you want to turn a fuse back on, which way do you have to go? You have to go up, right? Because that is deliberately breaking an affordance because something is wrong in that scenario, right? There's an issue, there's possibly, a device which is drawing too much power or there's a short circuit somewhere in the system. So it's trying to warn you in a very, very, very subtle way, right? But at the same time, it's something that you will realize, right? You won't automatically put that switch on without thinking about it, right? You have to actively push, resist your muscle memory and push it up to turn that back on. Whereas, like, if it's 3 in the morning and you just want to go to the loo, you don't have to think about how to turn the bathroom light on, right? So there are deliberate decisions. These are called design affordances. It's also the reason doors work in certain ways. You usually have door handles which work in a particular way when you're trying to open something. In architecture is filled with this. For instance, almost every step anywhere typically has a 6.5-inch riser. And changing that height by 1/2 inch can actually increase the likelihood of accidents by something like 30%. Right? So these conventions exist for a very good reason because we build in force of habit, we build in muscle memory, and we can take these to new platforms that we work on, right? Because we are really the architects of the digital era, and we need to build these things into the work that we do. So this is what it used to look like. I'll just run through some of the other screens. This was what, say, an album looked like. So you could jump into an album, preview a song, maybe purchase it if you really wanted to. This is now a way in which a couple of different views were represented, a search view, a library, etc. So you can see that there's a lot of Chrome. Are you familiar with the term Chrome? Yeah? Okay, so it's basically all the extra stuff, you know, the toolbar, the form fields, the labels, the headers, everything else, right? Except the content. So in fact, I've highlighted, if you look at this screen, right, only about 40% of it is actually content that a user would be interested in, whereas the rest is Chrome, right? So that's not a very efficient use of space. And that's also why Google has come out with its with its design guidelines, which it's thought about, because it's made sure that you don't take a lot of space with things like Chrome, and you put them in places where people know where to find them. So you always know how to do a search, for instance, or where do you go to go back within an app, etc. So yes, before you know, at that point in time, the app was designed by engineers, right? There was very little design thinking which had gone into it. I'm sure you're familiar with these fairly famous engineers who have invaded popular culture. There's also a bit of a pun here because they're in a library. I was showing you the library, and I'm going to show you the library. So I'm really sorry. I'll move on. Yeah. Sorry. As a policy. Yeah. So this is what I was talking about, right? There was very little adherence to what are called the platform guidelines, right? How should Android apps work? Where should the up button go? How should the back navigation work? Where should titles go? There was very little adherence to those guidelines, which is wasteful because you make your users think about things that they don't need to at all, right? There were also extremely complex interactions, right? If you wanted to search for a song and then look at all the albums which match that search, it was like a 4-click process. Whereas on a smartphone, if you've used a smartphone, you're probably not going to want to spend 10 seconds, you know, with this phone polling the internet each time before you find like one song from an album which you're searching for. Yeah. The other thing which is very common in engineering-heavy companies is that design decisions typically get led by engineering priorities or debt. So are you familiar with the concept of tech debt? Tech debt is the right term, right? Engineering debt, right? So there are certain decisions that you take, you know, because you're like, oh, it's too hard to do this, so let's do this quick hack right now, you know, and get something out of the door. Whereas that later down the line can come back and bite you, right? Yeah, and the other thing was a larger weakness, which is sort of common through most of India, is that there's little understanding, through most of the world really. The mobile offers, you know, completely unique opportunities to do different things, right? It's completely unlike any of the platforms which have come before, yet it shares many commonalities. So people often design as if it's a browser, but it isn't, right? You have so much more happening. You have so much access to a lot of very rich data. You have a lot of context information available to you. You have completely different use cases, right? When I'm checking Twitter at home, right, I'm sitting in front of a large monitor, right? There's typically not too much noise and distraction, and so I can focus on wasting my time on Twitter, right? However, when I'm checking Twitter on my mobile, I'm often doing something extremely stupid like trying to cross a really busy road while also glancing at my phone and trying to look at like the latest updates from my friends, right? So completely different environment, completely different needs from each place, right? In one case, you might want just the right amount of information, right? You need to find, I'm sure all of you have done this, you're looking up directions to a place that you don't know how to get to, right? You're looking at your phone, I've seen people actually using phones on bikes. Please don't do this if you do. But yeah, how do you design to support such a situation where attention is in limited supply, but you have a whole bunch of different strengths which you can tap into, right? You can say, where is somebody? So you can update your information based on that. Lots of stuff. Holo. Is anybody familiar with the term Holo when you apply it to Android? Anybody? Yeah, one, two, couple of people. Okay, so Holo is the code name for Android's design guidelines and the visual language which it uses, which is very light on gradients, chrome, heavy shadows, etc. It's a very flat aesthetic. If any of you use Google's stock Android OS, you will have seen this. So if you use a Nexus device or some of the ones which the manufacturers have not overlaid too heavily, right? So, yeah. So we're going to stop for a second, and we're going to talk about. Can you click? Yeah. So we're going to talk about space in which Flyte falls in terms of where it is as an application, right? So this is a very famous chart if you have ever had the misfortune of going to business school, which thankfully I have not. But it's typically, it basically talks about how likely somebody is to do a certain thing, right? So with everything that we're working on, right, with an app that you're building, with a service that you're building out, with a website, there's typically some action that you want your user to do, right? In this case, we wanted people to purchase music, which was incredibly hard in India, right? Because people were like, I actually noticed on the funnel, somebody, where we submit up talk proposals, somebody said, why should I purchase the music? Is it going to give me better quality? And the answer is not really, right? You can't really tell the difference between, say, 256 kbps and 320 kbps. I don't know if I can even tell the difference between 128 and anything above, right? And yeah, free versus 15 rupees. Show of hands for 15 rupees. Anybody who wants to spend 15 rupees right now, you can leave the money here. And I will send you a song by email. Right? Versus anybody who wants to spend 0 rupees and get a whole album. That sounds like a pretty good deal, right? I thought so. So anyway, this chart basically talks about there are low motivation for a user to change his or her behavior down in this corner of the graph, right? Whereas there's a high motivation in that corner. For instance, you're likely to use a service like Zomato because it's A, free, of course, but B, it also tells you where the best place to get food is, right, in a particular place. Does Zomato work for Goa? No? Okay, that's Just Dial. So a similar service. I'm sure you've used some service to find recommendations on where to eat, etc. Right? So yeah, there's typically high motivation up in that corner, but low motivation down here, and it's bounded on this side by how easy is it to use a service or an app or a product or whatever it is. Versus, so it's hard in this corner and easy in this corner. And here we have something called the action line. So anything which falls above this action line will actually cause that trigger or that action to happen. Whereas anything that falls here in this kind of shadow region will not happen, right? So if your app, like Flyte was, there was low motivation to use it and it was incredibly hard to use, nobody's going to use it, right? And that was borne out by our download numbers, etc., right? But what we wanted, ideally, well, at least the business guys were like, we want our app up there, right? But it's very difficult to build motivation in other people, right? You can't really do that very easily. But the one variable we did have under our control was that we could make it much easier to use. So you bring it at least here, so it falls slightly above the action line, so at least some people or some number of people, some proportion of the people will actually use it. So that's what we tried to do. We said we have no control about how other people perceive music or paid legal music. What we can at least do is make the best possible app. So that's what we tried to do. Right? So we had a couple of goals. And depending on how much time I have, we'll go into the short-term and the long-term ones. But in the short term, we said, let's try getting platform consistency out there. let's try and get design consistency. So, even between different screens, it looks like the app is good looking. We said, okay, is it possible to actually empower developers so that they don't need to constantly come back to designers if they're making decisions? So they can make good design decisions even if they don't necessarily have a design education. Yes, and reduce how difficult, of course, a lot of this stuff was. Like I remember that purchasing a song, which, you want to make the easiest thing because that's the least likely thing that people are going to do, had like 14 steps, something like that, right? So not likely to happen. Yeah, and longer term, we wanted to grow the product. So we wanted to build in some way of making decisions in a way and getting data on whether those decisions were good ones or bad ones, right? Not just saying, okay, Rahul feels like blue today, so let's put blue in the app. Rahul feels like, let's put new releases above and old releases below or bestsellers below, just because I feel like, right? We wanted to have some way of validating those decisions that we had taken. So, yeah, so we'll talk about the library first. Right? So what you'll see here is a very iterative process that I did, and you'll see it growing sort of from incomplete to ugly, circling back to incomplete, going through ugly, and hopefully coming out somewhere where it's slightly nicer. So you can run, yeah. So you'll see a lot of interesting experiments. We said, let's match the header colors. Let's have some indications for which songs are playing. Let's introduce like the Android tab bar, and now you see the most standard Android tab bar at the top. Then we said, let's have a now playing widget, and we said, let's put it below. Let's have separators. Let's have progress bars. Let's actually finish our work. Let's change our typography to make the names more consistent or the hierarchy more apparent. Then we're like, okay, that bar on top is super ugly. Let's do something about it. So we did something about it. And then we're like, that gradient, it just looks like, a jacket from the 70s. Let's do something slightly more sober. We're like, okay, we don't have the time to actually do the now playing widget because we need to actually ship something. That was also sometimes a priority when our manager would, our boss would come. Yeah, so we continued to iterate on a bunch of these things. We said, okay, how can we minimize the amount of space that Chrome takes? So you see, we reduced a bunch of stuff. What does it look like when it's not there? Can we actually move it to, just that right-hand corner with the indicator right there? Let's add in like some branding colors, right? So let's have the more standard way of showing that this is the selected tab. What happens when we want to add more actions to a particular item, right? Let's put more stuff on the screen. Let's make it less gaudy, right? Let's clean up things. Let's add a slightly different visual style. Let's add the hamburger button, right? So there are lots of stuff which happened. Let's make the buttons slightly more easy to understand and use, right? So this eventually was something that we kind of ended up shipping at some point in time. But you can see that it was a very iterative process, lots of quick, small changes throughout the whole process, and which had a lot of back and forth happening, which we can maybe talk about, maybe one incident or maybe not like a really like fight one, but yeah, we can talk about one. So then, we tried to extend that visual style to the rest of the app. So you can see, certain decisions now which have been made, which we then changed around. So yeah, I'm going to run through some of these because we have not a huge amount of time. This is the player part. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this picture, but it's Sergey Brin's Tesla, which they painted pink for Halloween. So this was the player iterations which we then worked on. So we wanted to make album art really forefront it. So we said, how can we experiment with that some more? we went to a very Windows style, and then we came to something that we were a little bit more happy with. So I think something like this is roughly what we ended up shipping. So yeah, I won't go into too many of the details, but I think you get a sense of how sort of rapid design iterations can actually move something from, I don't know if you remember what it used to look like. Sorry, I'll have to jump back. But, it started out looking something like this. This was, the player screen. This was a search screen or a listing, etc. And we ended up with something, hopefully, I don't know what you guys think of it, but hopefully far easier on the eyes, far more easy for the user to actually work through and get used to, far more consistent as well throughout. So, right, so that's... So I'm going to stop there for a second. And since we have only 10 minutes or so, we wanted to punctuate it with questions. So if you have questions so far, let's take them and then we'll go on. Anybody have questions that they want to ask about anything? Yeah, sure. So I think his question for you, those of you who didn't hear it, was how can a programmer who doesn't necessarily understand too much design, how can they design something which doesn't look really bad, right? So I think that one thing that Google has done over the last 2 years or so is that they've actually created a lot of really good design resources. So if you go to developer.android.com, which is, the Android developer site, there's actually a whole section on design. I think it's given equal priority with development and with marketing or whatever, releasing your apps or whatever it's called, right? There's a huge amount of stuff which is really useful there. And I think there's one more session which is going to talk specifically about the Android design guidelines today, which are, simplify my life, make me beautiful, delight me, enchant me, all of those, right? So these are like high-level design guidelines which were set up. So they start with the high level, and then they go into making it very, very clear as to how exactly you can do so. They provide things as basic as use these colors, use these 4 colors, and these 8 variants within these colors, right? They say, if you want icons, download this whole free pack of icons from here, use it within your app, right? Use this font which we make available for free. If you're building an action bar, take this. I think they actually give you code samples as well, which you can just grab and put into your app, right? They also have, if you're trying to do X component, they have guidelines around how that should look and how it should function, etc. So that's one really good resource. It's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. But for instance, reading these guidelines would probably take you about 1 day, maybe one more day if you want to get into it in some detail, right? So I think if you spend 2 days really going into the design guidelines in detail for a programmer.
So let me try.
Yeah.
This. So one thing that, like you said, read the Android design guidelines and actually try to understand them. And if you've built an app before, it's a lot better, because then you can think about, hey, I put my up button over here. Does that meet the guidelines? If you've never built an app and you read the guidelines, you won't be able to question them as much, right? So for us, the developers on the team, we actually had a lot of discussions as we were reading the guidelines. We did it in a room. So we got people to read. We got into a room and then we went over the guidelines. And then whoever had doubts, we would discuss it. Right? And, we've done this in our app. We've used the up button like a back button. Is that the correct paradigm? Right? So, guidelines. The other thing is, I don't remember the site, but there was a site with a lot of good, well-designed apps. Like they had screenshots or... yeah, so that was a very good way to get ideas. You just look at that site. They've got images or screenshots of lots of popular apps. And sometimes, as an engineer, I know I need to do something, like a player. I need a player, I need some play buttons, but I'm not exactly sure whether I want to put them on the top or on the bottom. And you go to that site, you see a lot of those images, and then you get, it just helps give you ideas. The third part was getting used to the design tools. So if you have an illustrator, like a designer or someone who's actually going to draw out the layouts for you, then that's fine. That person is working with Adobe and building stuff for you. But if you don't, then you will have to get your hands dirty, use Fireworks or Photoshop, and at least try to do something. That's something that I suck at. Like, I'm not very good. And if I need to do some real useful imagery, I just send it to Rahul and I say, dude, can you send me something back? And he'll send me a link to some other site and say, go do it yourself. So he's not very useful that way. But I think he bribed the guy in the back. So I think you will have to sort of get your hands dirty with the tools. And in the beginning it's hard, but once you start putting some designs together, you will, like, it'll actually feel good. You'll be like, hey, I was able to create a nice layout. So I think the three things: guidelines, getting ideas from other apps, whether it's from that site, or just look at apps, right? Look at apps that you think are appealing. Like, look at the Zomato app, look at the ClearTrip app. There will be think about the apps, right? What is this app doing? Why is this easier than, another app? So these are some things that help.
Design guidelines defined by Android. Because from my experience, I told my designer to go through the website. There are enough tutorials of the same application. He told I haven't understood anything. He is a typical designer. He knows Photoshop exactly, he do a lot of design, but he told me, you want to explain me. I went to the documentation, I have this is the parameters, you want to explain me. What do you think about that approach?
I think that... yeah, so his question is, how easy is it for a designer to understand the Android design guidelines? So I think there are two ways you can approach the design guidelines. You can approach it as a reference book, which is what I recommend. If you have trouble with, you're doing a dialog box, just go there, look at the dialog box, implement it, right? You don't have to understand the high-level stuff if that's complicated for your designer, right? So I think that, as Gaurav said, the best way to actually understand it is by doing and by, working on an app. And then you'll see the problems, because people will come and say, your app sucks, or, I don't know how to do this on your app, or whatever it is, right? You can do what I call the coffee day experiment, right? Which is that you take 300 rupees, you go to any coffee day, you find two people who are sitting down, and you say, hey, I'll buy your coffee, just use my app to do X thing. And then just watch them as they try and use your app, right? And most of the time people will be very happy if you buy them a coffee, right? And they'll be like, yeah, sure, we'll give you 10 minutes of our time. And that's really useful for you to see how people are actually interacting with your application, right? This is what's called usability testing. It's a very bastardized form of it, but it's a, it's one step anyway in the whole process. So that's something that you can do.
Yeah, don't try that at a bar, because people will be drunk and like, dude, your app is awesome. Right? So.
Yes, sir.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to know how much time it actually took in kind of reaching from the previous version to this version. And the second question is, you mentioned that you added in something which you could capture user feedback. So was it something like Google Analytics that was used in there, or what was actually inside the app?
Gaurav answer part of this. How much time it took is difficult to pinpoint, because design-wise, I think we finished it off in 3 weeks or 2 weeks or something like that. And then Eng took
He's lying. He's lying. No, but I think the simple answer is end-to-end. What you saw is about 6 months worth of work, but it's not that simple because we were doing at least a couple of other apps at the same time. So it was not dedicated on the MP3 app. And like you said, there were a lot of iterations, right? So we did the library first, and I think player was later, and so it's, there is no, I can't give you a very good timeline, but as he said, the design process, thinking about the library, probably took about 2 weeks. Then we implemented a certain version, tried to get it out, got some feedback, right? Then we did more iterations. So,
yeah. It depends.
The other part was we used something like Google Analytics. It's a framework called Omniture. We used it because Flipkart is already using Omniture for their website. If you're, I would not recommend it. Like, just use Google Analytics or Flurry.
I found programming really hard.
I found designing really hard.
I think that, for instance, there was one portion, like, the library may be worth getting into. We had the concept of an offline versus online library, which was, a library which was on your device versus songs which were in the cloud or which you had bought but which you weren't on your device, right? And they were separated out. So I came in and I was fairly unaware of the ramifications or the consequences of taking certain decisions on engineering time. And actually, if you're a better designer, you have to keep that in mind as well, right? You have to realize that if you're going to do something which then backlogs engineering for 3 months or whatever it is, right? That's probably not the best design decision for the product at that point in time. So if I had been more experienced at that point in time, I may not have taken that particular decision. But I said this makes no sense. A user shouldn't have to worry about whether the song is on your device, in the cloud, wherever it is, right? He doesn't care. He wants to listen to a song. He wants to listen to Sheila Ki Jawani. He doesn't care whether it's downloaded, bought, not bought, preview, this, that. I want to listen to a song. And
on the engineering side, it was actually fairly complicated. Because, if the song is on the cloud, there wasn't and if the song already happened to be on the device but wasn't bought through Flipkart, then how do we figure that out? If it was bought through Flipkart but the metadata changed, like sometimes you see the track, the album name or the artist name, and there will be cases on Flipkart or iTunes where that metadata is wrong. Right? So users will report it, the service will fix it. Right? So for us to be able to handle situations like that, from an engineering perspective, was very hard. We spent a lot of time trying to make sure that what we come up with works. But from as you said, from a design perspective, it's like, dude, just you have songs in the cloud, songs here. It should just look like one view, and it should be simple. And so that's a good example of where you had to work closely with the designer and call out some of the constraints, and then come up with something reasonable in the short term. I think, we're out of time.
We have one question more if you have any, but I think we're out of time. Yeah.
Especially if you have a new app, you just install it, you open it up. You have a lot of pages that come up and you can say, like, to click on next, there's some text there, sometimes. So I just literally go next. And I don't read the information that is there to it, how you use the app. I want to know, how would you improve the app to the design in such a way that the user doesn't really have to go through it, even though he's not in the mood, or maybe he might be in the mood to read it, or maybe not.
So there are many ways of doing that, solving that, right? There's the easy way, there's a middle way, there's a really hard way. And all of those have different levels of benefits and complexity, which both come in at the same time. One is, make your app so simple that you don't need to explain how to use an app. It's an app. You shouldn't need a manual to understand it, right? That's part A. If you do need a manual, maybe you can give people advice at times when they look like they need it, If you're talking about how do you add a song, don't show it to me right in the beginning. Maybe show it to me when I get to the library page. right? Whatever, show information where it is relevant, contextually, right? The hardest thing which I've seen some very good apps doing is that they actually build profiles of users, in terms of, is this user good, like a novice, average, advanced, power user? When was the last time the user opened the app? So, how long has the user not used this app for? Are there new features which are complex? And then you create an entire matrix mapping people at different points within this three-dimensional space, and then give them the appropriate information, maybe even change the way the app works. I saw one where they, have a large button with text, whereas they replace it with just an icon if the user is a power user and knows really how to get through the app. So there are different ways of solving that thing. Easiest way is, of course, make your app simple. So, but thanks, and we'll be around. So if you want to catch up with us, please do so.